Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Planko podcast. I'm Max, and today we're in Dubai, and I'm joined by Sahil. Welcome to the podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
Find you on Instagram at decluttering.coach. Link down below for that. So why decluttering coach?
I think it's an accidental decluttering exercise, really. I was on a trip about 4 years ago in Europe with a bunch of friends, some very dear friends. And I was in an environment where I was not being judged. And I couldn't remember the last time I was in such an environment or where I didn't care about what other people thought. I've been wearing, I've later found out, all these masks through the years. And here I felt free. So I was so overwhelmed by this experience of just being me. And I was probably, the last time I was me was when I was a young child. And I was so overwhelmed that when I came back, I said, why can't I feel like that every day? And I realized, okay, I live in a city or in a world where I am going to be judged, but even if I can get to half of what I felt for those few days, I'm in a much better place than I am today.
Yeah.
And then I asked myself, well, what's stopping me getting there? What clutter is holding me down? And that's where the decluttering process began, because I started identifying things one at a time and saying, right, this is holding me down. Let's work on it, and then propel.
Yeah, where do you think those masks came from, though?
I have a tendency, and I believe this goes back again to my childhood, of always wanting to please others.
Don't we all? We all want to be loved, We all want people to appreciate us. We all want those likes on Instagram and those followers.
Yeah, absolutely. And, even without social media, I just wanted to be loved. And I guess that resulted in me doing things for others regardless of how it felt for me or what it meant for me. Even if I'm tired and someone says, hey, can you help out on something, I'd always be the one who reaches out and says yes. I wouldn't say no very often. So I was focusing more on others than I was focusing on myself.
Okay, so you were selflessly giving without focusing on, first of all, on yourself and making yourself happy, which is what a lot of people do tend to forget these days in our society.
Absolutely.
And when was this trip to Europe?
This was in 2016.
Okay.
Yeah, I believe it was in May.
Coming up 4 years then.
Yeah, coming up 4 years.
And a lot has changed since then. So what made you decide to have this realization, which is great, but then there's a difference between having a realization and taking action upon it. So when did you decide, I'm going to become the decluttering coach as well?
So what happened was, over the years, I kept doing this exercise on myself. Yeah, I kept chipping away and decluttering from various things.
Like what, for example?
I decluttered from the material world. Yeah. It's a journey. So it's still continuing. It's not that I've done it. But the 4 areas that I focused on were the material world, my body, people, and the mind. And while I was doing this, I started sharing with those who are near and dear. And what happened was they started sharing with a couple of their friends. And then at one event, I had one of these individuals, a fellow named James, come up to me and say, Sahil, listen, what you shared has had a huge impact on my life. Don't keep it to yourself. You need to share with others. And for me, that was kind of my aha moment, right? And I'm a member of this organization called Entrepreneurs Organization, and they have learning events throughout the year. So the following calendar year in the organization, the learning chair came up to me and said, would you like to share your story? So I said, again, I always look for these signs. And I said, yes, absolutely. So I went and I shared my story. It's in a close-knit group. It went very well. They asked me to do another one. That went real well. And then eventually I said, I need to now move from a discussion, because it was more like a roundtable discussion, to a presentation. And being a little finicky, I said it has to look professional. If I made the presentation in PowerPoint, it would have looked awful. So I hired a professional company, and they helped put the presentation together. And luckily for me, I have a very dear friend. She's the owner of Dubai Scholars. They have a school, Clarion School, here in Dubai, and she opened it up for me to use to deliver my presentation. And I put the event on Eventbrite. I had about 35 people come for the first my first speaking engagement that was open to the public, and it went real well. And then I realized, this makes sense. It's clearly adding value to people's lives. And kind of the icing on the cake was, a month after that, or a few months after that, I got a phone call from Kenya. And they said, hey, I heard you're the Decluttering King. Yeah.
Oh,
So
king.
I said, yeah,
Wow.
king. So I said, look, I'm no king, but I do know a few things about
Okay.
decluttering. And they said, we'd like to invite you to come and speak to our organization. And that, again, was the entrepreneurs organization.
After your very first talk?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And, well, I'd done 2 inside the entrepreneurs organization,
Right.
and this member is from that same organization. Yeah. And then YPO in Kenya found out I was coming and said, hey, we'd like you to come and speak to us as well.
Yeah.
So next thing I know, I'm flying to another country, different continent. They're paying for all expenses and paying me to speak. And I mean, how much more validation do you need?
That's incredible.
And I love this. That's the key here is I'm passionate.
Yeah.
And if I can do this forever and just live every day passionately, what else do you want?
You've already won.
Yeah.
If that's the case. So then give us some insight. How do we declutter? Because what's the difference between decluttering and minimalism? Because we talked about the material side of it, that's an aspect of it. So what are the differences between the two?
I almost feel that minimalism is stage 2, because you first have to get into the rhythm of eliminating and reducing. So you want to get rid of things that you don't necessarily need, and you want to only buy what is absolutely necessary or what you feel is necessary. And once you get into that habit, then you can start looking at, okay, now how do I minimize? Because do I truly need all these things to be happy?
Yeah, I mean, clearly not. I mean, we're in my apartment / studio, and there's a million quantity of things that aren't necessary.
Yeah.
So where do you start?
I came up with this methodology. As I mentioned, you can almost imagine this archery target, right? And the outer circle is decluttering from the material world. And then you move on to the body, and then people. And as you get closer to the bullseye, and then the mind, which is the hardest, and then bullseye basically is helping you to find your purpose by becoming your authentic self. So I started, even though I didn't start with the material world, I always suggest people to start there. So go through your stuff. We all have plenty of things. We've all been to places and seen people with far fewer things than we have, and they're still happy. So then it begs the question, do I really need all this? So I just went through my closet. I thought that was a good starting point. And I divided my things into 3 piles. One was, I wear this often, I want to keep it. And then another pile was, I can't remember the last time I wore this. Clearly it's not required. And the third pile was, I'm on the fence. Do I keep it? Do I give it away? It's got some memory attached to it. So I said, let's just keep it there for now. So now the pile that I want to give away, what made it a lot easier is knowing that it's going to put a smile on someone else's face. It wasn't adding any benefit in my life, but it could add a lot to someone else's.
Yeah, so instead of giving something away, you're giving something to someone. So you're adding value instead of removing value.
Exactly.
That's a very powerful way to approach it. And speaking of clothes, if those of you who are listening to this and not watching it on YouTube, you have a beautiful t-shirt that says friends, not food. I do really like it. It's a good choice. And you said earlier about going back to becoming your authentic self.
Yeah.
So my question is, do you become your authentic self, or do you go back to your authentic self?
So it's removing all the clutter that has been added throughout your life. So it's really removing those layers and then going back to your pure self.
So
when we're born,
the child.
Yeah, when we're born. I mean, look at young children. They're just full of compassion and love. They don't have any masks, unfiltered.
Yeah.
That's what I want to go back to. That's what I believe the world needs to go back to. Because if we live a life with compassion and love, there wouldn't be misuse of trust. The world wouldn't have wars. We wouldn't be looking at each other and comparing and saying, comparing ethnicities or religions or genders or age. We just look at each other as beautiful souls. We wouldn't be mistreating animals and plants, the way that we are today. And we'd live in harmony with one another and the nature and Mother Earth.
Yeah. Were you vegan before you got into decluttering, or was that part of the process?
So funny story. I've been vegetarian my whole life, and dairy was a big part.
Through culture.
Through culture. That's how I was brought up. I mean, dairy was a big part of my diet. So big that every single meal consisted of some form of dairy. And then I used to actually make fun of vegans. I used to say, thank God I am not a vegan, because if I was, I'd shoot myself.